Hi and welcome back to a new video. This year we already had to suffer through two, at least from my side, pretty disappointing CPU launches, and now the 9800X 3D luckily doesn't repeat that. So there are some quite interesting and very important changes to the CPU compared to the 7800X 3D. And Gamers Nexus already did a very good and detailed video about this topic last week that you should definitely watch. The quick summary is that back on the 7800X 3D, you had all the cores on the bottom and then you had a cache on top. So all the heat that was coming from the cores had to go through the cache and then to the indium, to the heat spreader and to the cooler. And on the 9800X 3D, this is the opposite. So they put the cache on the bottom, put the cores on top, and this drastically improved temperatures. And not only that, the 9800X 3D now also allows overclocking. From my side, that is absolutely amazing, and that was what I was missing on the 5800X 3D and on the 7800X 3D. With a passion for IT and technical expertise, Hetzner offers innovative solutions for complex requirements worldwide. Through its own state-of-the-art data centers in Falkenstein, Nuremberg and Helsinki, as well as cloud locations in the US and Singapore, Hetzner prioritizes efficiency above all. The server auction offers both standardized systems and previously customized setups, all with no minimum contract term and no setup fee. Thanks to the server auction, hardware is reused sustainably, providing highly affordable systems while benefiting the environment. Find out all details about the server auction in the link below. AMD did not only flip the cache, but they also changed the complete layout. So previously we had the CCD on the bottom with the cores on the 7800X 3D, then the 3DV cache in the center, and then we had two placeholder tiles next to it, made from silicon, but basically, placeholders and dead silicon without any circuit inside. But now on the 9800X 3D, it is one large cache chip on the bottom, so no longer three pieces, and on top they put the CCDs with the cores. And also in between, they changed the thermal resistance by improving layers in between the CPU. That's already what you saw with Zen 5 in general, that it was running much colder, and all those improvements are inside the 9800X 3D. So we're talking about 20 to maybe 30 degrees Celsius improvement over the previous generation. You can also easily see that if you compare the 7950X 3D, that has one CCD with 3DV cache and one without, you could always see like 20 to 30 degrees Celsius difference between both of the chips, and that is no longer the case. We did some overclocking testing last year when I was visiting the ASUS HQ with the 7800X 3D that was not unlocked or not meant to be overclocked, but we had some unlocked BIOS from ASUS where we could bypass some voltage limits, and that's what we did, and increasing the voltage led to the CPU failure. I think it was just about 200 millivolt voltage increase, and yet the CPU died quite quickly. So I was like, okay, there is definitely some truth to it that the 7800X 3D was fragile when it came to overclocking. Well, maybe not overclocking in terms of increasing the clock, but definitely raising the voltage, which was definitely also increasing the temperature. And that's one of the biggest improvements that AMD did on the 9800X 3D, which allowed them to enable overclocking and make sure that it's also safe. AMD also said that it was not the cache that was so fragile and that it was dying, but it was because the cores underneath just couldn't stay as cold. Due to those mechanical limits, it was always that the 7800X 3D couldn't clock as high because it was just purely voltage and temperature limited, which is no longer the case here. And also you have to keep in mind that on the 9800X 3D, because the cache sits below and the cores on top, the core CCD itself is thinner than what you would see, for example, on the 9700X, because both share overall the same die height. But the 9800X 3D, because it's stacked, is lower for the CCD die height of the cores themselves, which typically means that it should improve the temperature even further. And all of this should be quite exciting for overclocking. And the result of all those changes you can see here in Cinebench R23, where the 9800X 3D beats the 7800X 3D by 25% in performance. However, it also consumes 50% more power, so it's much more power hungry. This means that overall the 7800X 3D here stays more efficient, but is also quite a bit slower. Of course, if we compare it to any of the 16-core CPUs like the 9950X or even the 285K, the 9800X 3D doesn't really have a chance here, but that was also expected and probably changes once the 9950X 3D arrives. I also took your feedback from the previous video where we were testing the 285K at a higher memory speed. We were testing with 8800 megatransfers, and now I retested the 285K at 6000 C30. So all of the configurations of all CPUs are performed at the same memory speed because you guys requested that. However, you have to keep in mind that Intel still has the better memory controller that allows for higher speed. So that means that it's a slight disadvantage for Intel. The 9800X 3D definitely benefits from the higher core clock, as you can see here in multi-core threaded workloads such as HWBot X265. We see a strong performance improvement over the 7800X 3D of 35%, while the power consumption only increased by 21%. So in this application, this is a pretty awesome ratio. But again, obviously doesn't have a chance versus the high core count CPUs. For example, the 9950X is much faster and also quite efficient, while the 285K from Intel is the fastest CPU in this benchmark. Finally, going over to the gaming benchmarks, and as usual in my charts, you can see the average FPS in yellow, the 1% low FPS in the darker yellow, and the average power consumption in blue. It's always the average over 50 minutes, so it's a very realistic power consumption value. It is not a peak power consumption value. In Remnant 2, the 9800X 3D just beats everything and is really efficient. With 60 watt under load, I don't really see any difference to the 7800X 3D. The minimum FPS or the 1% lows increased by 12% to 82 FPS, while the average FPS increased by 7%. Both Intel 285K and 4900KS have absolutely no chance. In Cyberpunk, I could observe a slight increase of power consumption by 17 watt, but it's overall, at least from my perspective, still in a very good and efficient area. I couldn't really observe an increase in the 1% low FPS, however the average FPS increased by 11%. Now if we compare the 9800X 3D with the Intel 285K, it is 30% faster on the average FPS, so that is really a lot. In Valorant, we can see a performance increase over the 7800X 3D by about 3 to 6%, looking at the 1% low and the average FPS. And here the power consumption was even lower than on the 7800X 3D, which makes this CPU overall the most efficient. The 14900KS is a little bit faster here when it comes to the average FPS, however it is slower when you look at the 1% lows, which are just more important in the end. The high FPS shooter Counter-Strike 2 also benefits drastically from the 9800X 3D. The performance increase versus the previous gen is about 6 to 8%, which matches exactly what AMD was promising or advertising so far with the 9800X 3D. Now here, again, as I told you, I retested the 285K with the slower memory and this definitely didn't help. Again, it's extremely slow, especially with the 6000 C30, so that didn't help at all. In Assassin's Creed Mirage, I could observe the highest jump in performance, and it's absolutely impressive how much performance Zen 5 architecture in combination with 3D cache delivers. We are talking about 20 to 30% performance increase, and with this, the 9800X 3D even beats the 14900KS, which was previously always the fastest CPU for me in this game or scenario. I'm only testing 5 games here, so that's not the big picture. I think you would have to look at 10 to 20 games probably to see what the real improvement of the CPU versus the 7800X 3D would be. But at least for me, in my scenarios, it's a plus of 10% in performance, while the CPU increased 4% in power consumption, which I think is a very healthy ratio and very interesting, makes the CPU very fast, very efficient still. And we didn't even talk about overclocking yet, which we will still do. But before we get to that, we will jump into Cinebench and also just looking into a game that you can get a feeling of how this CPU performs in the real world. In Cinebench, you should see temperatures, at least with my CPU, mid-70s to approaching 80 degrees Celsius, which is a lot lower than what you saw on the 7800X 3D. And that is while the CPU is clocking a lot higher. As you can see, it's above 5.2 GHz across all of the 8 cores, which is the explanation why the CPU just performs so much faster in Cinebench or high multi-core loads versus the 7800X 3D. Power consumption, as you can see, 135 to 140 watt, and in this case, 22,600 points. In the gaming scenarios, I could observe the same kind of clock as with high multi-threading, such as Cinebench. So again, 5225 megahertz on the cores that are loaded, as you can see. Temperature is pretty solid. I could see between 50 and 60 degrees Celsius. The highest temperature I could see in Assassin's Creed Mirage with about 60 degrees Celsius, which is still pretty nice with a 360 AIO and gives us a lot of headroom for overclocking, and we will even do Delidding obviously and Direct Die, so that should give us even more headroom. But first, quick cat break. I hope you could relax a bit and I have your attention back. So stock condition was about 51, 52 degrees Celsius under gaming scenario load. In Cinebench we saw up to 74 to 76 degrees Celsius under load, while the core voltage stock was between 1.13 and 1.18 volt. That is the stock condition, and now we're going to delete the CPU. Delidding of the 9800X 3D is very similar to all the other Ryzen 9000 or also Ryzen 7000 CPUs. The Ryzen 7000 Delidded is still compatible, and I think we showed this already, plenty of times, so I don't have to show all this process over and over again. I'm currently waiting for the liquid metal to take off the rest of the indium. And just a note, I had to move the slider back and forth 39 times to remove the IHS. Sunho, the in-house overclocker from Asus, also already did this, and he had to do it over 80 times. So there seems to be quite a big tolerance in terms of how often you have to shift it until the IHS comes loose. I'm not sure if I would recommend what I'm doing. I did it so far on 2 CPUs and both survived. To polish the CPU with thermal paste and a Dremel seems to be working, but I'm not sure if it's sustainable or if it might actually kill a CPU. Definitely a big difference before and after. I always do it by hand usually, and I'm, as I said before, not sure if this is smart or not. I'm just trying this. I will keep you updated if it works, but so far it seems to be okay. The reason I'm doing this is to get rid of all the remaining particles, such as gold, that will have interactions with the liquid metal and might negatively impact aging especially. So I will now apply a fresh layer of liquid metal and then put the Mycro Direct Die Pro on top. So now we place the cooler on top. So let's do a quick check. And that looks good. CPU is definitely alive. I will not do the overclock for now. We will first compare the temperatures in the stock condition. We're looking at Cinebench first. Check if the clock is still the same, 5225 megahertz. That is in line. Look at those temperatures. The magic between what AMD did on the CPU and Direct Die is just incredible. We can see like 45 to 50 degrees Celsius under Cinebench load. That is just absolutely crazy low temperature on the CPU. That's a reduction of about 15 to 20 degrees Celsius on the CPU, which then also causes the CPU to drastically consume less power. I would say about 15 to 20 watt less. We went from closing in on 140 to maybe like 120 to 125 watt under load. And that should definitely help us when we will soon touch the CPU for overclocking. Of course, the load in gaming is a lot less. It's about half than what we saw in Cinebench. That's also why the temperature benefit is only about half. We went down from 52 to 40 degrees Celsius, which I think is still great and should give us a lot of headroom for overclocking. With the quick and manual overclock, I could push the cores to 5.6 and maintaining, I would say, a moderate voltage. Stock I could see up to 1.18, and now we're running 1.28, so it's 100 millivolt increase, and that was enough for 25,200 points roughly. I still have to run it 5 times and take the average. Under load, you can see still 5.6 gigahertz across all the cores. And the temperatures, I would say, are pretty nice. They're still in the region of about 60 degrees Celsius, which should be very healthy, even though we massively overclocked the CPU with about 100 millivolt voltage increase. And that leads to also increasing the CPU package power, but I would also say that this is still in an okay region. Stock we saw about 135 to 140, and now we're at about 160 watts. So I think even with 400 megahertz increase, those values look very healthy. Now done correctly, you can see a performance increase to 25,200 points. That is an extra of 10%, while the power consumption increased by 16%, which is a bit more, but I would say that is still in a healthy ratio. So you can get an extra of 10% performance for multi-threading, and the temperatures, I would say, are still very good and healthy for daily use. Again, also in gaming, temperatures are still very good. We see still below 50 degrees Celsius, clock is stable at 5.6, and that was just an overclock of like 1 hour. Like really sloppy, no attention to detail. I'm not sure what you could do with like PBO and curve optimizer and all that, but it just shows how much potential the 9800X 3D has. In Assassin's Creed Mirage, the 9800X 3D with its 5.6 GHz all-core overclock gains another 5 to 7% in performance. It boosts the minimum FPS to 125 and average to 204, making it by far the fastest CPU in this test and all of my benchmarks. But it also increased the power consumption quite a bit to 90 watt under load, which I think is still quite nice. And it's still less than the new Intel 285K. The 9800X 3D combines everything that I was wishing for in terms of a CPU. It improved everything from the 5800X 3D to the 7800X 3D that I was missing in terms of modifications, overclocking. Everything is possible on the 9800X 3D, and it also performs really good in the stock condition. It's also very, very cold in the stock condition. So overall, I would say pretty awesome CPU. I had a very good experience with it, no trouble whatsoever. AMD, thank you for unlocking this CPU. That made me really happy. I'm not sure how much sense it makes if you have a 7800X 3D and you are thinking to upgrade. Probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but if you're planning to upgrade from an older CPU, I think this could be a very, very good choice, but it will also depend on the price, which I currently don't know. So that's something you have to check locally, obviously, but just from a technical perspective, that is a pretty awesome CPU. Thanks AMD, and thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Bye bye.